The next speaker is Sergo Mikoyan, perhaps one of the youngest historical protagonists, who is a famous analyst of the relations between the Soviet Union and Cuba and the Soviet Union and Latin America throughout the years. Thank you. Comrade Fidel Castro, Cuban friends, Russian and American colleagues. During my intervention, I will try to very briefly respond to what Fidel said yesterday regarding the material published on the talks between Mikoyan and Khrushchev regarding the deployment of missiles in Cuba. I would also like to respond to questions posed by McNamara with the view that during my talks I will try to respond to these questions. So I will be able to answer any questions after I finish my presentation. When McNamara asked which would have been the reaction of the United States, or what reaction would be the reaction of the United States with respect to the actions conducted by the Soviet government, I think the position is quite clear. They proposed to transport the missiles publicly and in accordance with an agreement. And with respect to the attitude of the Kremlin, from my intervention, you will be able to see that only Mikoyan foresaw all the complications that would result from the discovery by the United States of the missiles. The other Kremlin leadership did not foresee this possibility or the consequences, or simply they didn't even think about this possibility. Why can I say this? According to the tradition since the times of Stalin, the word leader has always been considered to be the last. However, the last has the last say. This was not the case of my father. And my father responded. The other members of the leadership remained silent, but because to argue with Khrushchev was not ethical nor in keeping with the party procedures. So it was best not to even try to do so. And they didn't understand anything about foreign policy and therefore had nothing to say. McNamara asked if there was contradictions between the Cuban and Soviet leaders. And of course, the Cuban leadership present here know me very well. And they are also familiar with what my father said. And this is also in the archives, my personal archives. Mikoyan said that when Khrushchev returned from Bulgaria, he always thought that there would be an invasion against Cuba. That this invasion could be in the near future, could take place in the near future, and it must be stopped. And and it was therefore necessary to send missiles, deploy missiles in Cuba. This was something that was very risky, extremely risky, and instead of ensuring or guaranteeing Cuba's security, it could provoke a blow or direct actions by the Americans against Cuba, and he could therefore considered it was not necessary to do this. Khrushchev analyzed this proposal with the Kremlin, and no one opposed this, and therefore addressed the Minister of Defense, Malinowski, and as according to my father, Malinowski said or endorsed this decision, and he considered that thus there would be a strategic balance. This would give the Soviet Union a strategic balance with respect to the United States. And of course, the number of warheads continued to be the same. However, since, as we were able to hear yesterday, the Soviet Union had very small intercontinental missile carriers. And in the Times, an article was published that said that the medium-range missiles plus Cuba was equal to an intercontinental missile. And since the missiles were in Cuba, therefore, they were tantamount to intercontinental missiles. And the 24 that we had in the territory of the Soviet Union, 42 more were added, and many more had been foreseen in the original plan. Which were the complications that my father had envisaged or considered, or with the Cuban leadership? It was possible for more, and out of the missiles that were deployed in Cuba, Fidel Castro said yesterday that these missiles were deployed for the interest of the socialist bloc. Now, with respect to Khrushchev and Mikoyan, I believe that since the very onset, they were thinking about Cuba. And Khrushchev, in his memoirs, spoke about the interest of the Soviet bloc as well. Then, later on, Khrushchev, in one of his telegrams, said that we did it for the sake of Cuba and also for our own sake. This was in November. And in May, he was referring to the defense of Cuba, and in November, he talks about the interest of the Soviet Union as well, and explains which was precisely the interest of the Soviet Union. The victory of the Cuban Revolution was a great success of the Marxist-Leninist science, as well as therefore a defeat of the Cuban Revolution would have a double significance, not only for the region but for the socialist bloc as well, since this defeat would represent an obstacle for the national liberation movements, and the imperialist forces would prevail throughout the world, and we could not allow this. And as a result, we must put an end. And therefore, the revolutionary movement throughout the world cannot be stopped. And if we can analyze this phrase, based on the words spoken by Fidel Castro yesterday, then it is absolutely, this action is absolutely justified, because the deployment of the missiles was undertaken for the defense of Cuba, because it was necessary to defend Cuba for the sake of the socialist bloc as a whole.
Надо сказать, что в литературе
It is also necessary to underline that in the bibliography that was published in the United States, which is quite extensive, the complexities and the contradictions between Mikoyan and the Cuban leadership in November of 1962 have been exaggerated. And in order to confirm this, I would like to read a telegram from Moscow. It seems to me that now we can undertake or draw some conclusions from these talks. This telegram was sent after the second conversation. In the first interview, which was carried out, which took place in my own apartment, and I would like to remind you that this interview did not conclude because my mother passed away. And this Mikoyan received this news in the first interview, which took place in Fidel's apartment. And I learned about this at the end of the interview. The second interview took place in the palace of the... Every time I was received in a room, or we met in a room or in the halls, and they accompanied me to the car. They said goodbye. And I was received with great cordiality everywhere I went. I think this is very important because many people say that Fidel Castro did not receive Mikoyan during the first 2 weeks. And also they say as well that he had to wait for 2 hours before he was received by Fidel Castro. I think that this is not true. I was the one who was waiting. And then Fidel said what he said yesterday. We have no doubt whatsoever that all the nuclear weapons, the arms were withdrawn. We consider that the installation of the missiles in Cuba had to do with the interest of the socialist bloc, of all the socialist countries. It had a psychological impact because the issue was to contain the plans of aggression of the United States, therefore, and that is why the missiles were installed in Cuba, not only to defend the interest of Cuba, but also to defend the rest of the socialist bloc. This was carried out with our consent. We recall the importance of this issue, and we think it is correct. We are not in favor of the measures. The measures that were adopted had two objectives. First, to prevent an invasion, and also to prevent a world war. And in this situation, was not only a tense situation, but there was also camaraderie. But in spite of all this, there were difficulties, and the first of which was that the leadership of the Cuban Revolution learned of the news on the radio on October the 28th, and I consider sincerely that this was something which was unthinkable on the part of the Kremlin leadership, which affected my father and affected Khrushchev and everyone who was at the Kremlin. Comrade Fidel said very diplomatically, but with great conviction. And when my father said that we simply didn't have time, he responded. He said, we could analyze these issues, these delicate issues, in another manner. But the threat of the United States was the fundamental reason for the deployment of the weapons in Cuba. When Kennedy proposed to Khrushchev, we can say that the Soviet Union was willing to dismantle the missiles. But when analyzing it with the Cuban leadership, in my view, this is how the problem should have been resolved without giving the immediate order to evacuate the strategic weapons. This would have lowered international tension and also would have given the possibility to analyze the situation under different conditions, and also the signing of a statement or a declaration. I believe that Comrade Fidel Castro was right in this respect.
Дал согласие на инспекцию на
Khrushchev agreed with the inspection of Cuban territory, and this, he had no right whatsoever to do this. When he consented, he did not think that Cuba, since it was Cuban territory, the consent must be given or should be given by the Cuban government.
ввиду того, что меня все-таки ограничивают.
And to adjust myself to the time available, I should leave out many interesting aspects. The problem of the inspection. It was decided by Mikoyan when he came to Havana. Since from New York he spoke with Mr. John Mikoyan, and he himself told him that if Fidel Castro did not accept the inspection of the missiles in Cuba, then we could do so in offshore, we say, when his ships had abandoned the Cuban ports. And the U.S. ships would come closer to the Soviet ships, and they would carry out a visual inspection at a short distance. So this problem was solved. I do not really know why my father had to speak about the inspection in Cuban ports. I personally believe that this was not necessary. because the instructions of the Kremlin did not exist, and that was an instruction on behalf of the Kremlin that he carried out when he spoke with Fidel about this idea that they could inspect the ships in the Havana harbor. The reaction, of course, of the Cuban leadership was very sharp. It was a very strong one, and there was an exchange of opinion which was a little unfortunate. During the talks, Comrade Fidel Castro said, or told Mikoyan, a truth, that today it continues being a truth for my American colleagues. It would be worthwhile for the Americans to give this step. And if they give the first step, they would have to give a second and a third. And this will have no end at all. And then these concessions would have no end. And I believe when I research this, that the United States could never stop. They always demand more and more and more. This we have been able to see in Bosnia, Yugoslavia, and in other parts of the world. And Fidel Castro did not know what was going to happen in the future, but he knew the United States. He already knew about this for 150 years. He knew the tactics of the Americans, that they negotiate one concession after another, and it was followed up in the 20th century. And we would have reached the 21st century the same way. And to end, there is a book, a large book here that I'm not going to read, so don't be worried about this. But I just wanted to say that in the talks between Fidel Castro and Mikoyan, my father said, "You know the friends better than we do. Don't look for better friends than we are, because we are the best friends in the world." And unfortunately, my father was not able to see the future, because 30 years after, the USSR stopped being the best friend of Cuba, and unfortunately, the concessions were not necessary. And finally, unfortunately, this was not for the benefit of our country. And what my father had said, that the USSR was the best friend of Cuba, was not a solid expression. It did not last long. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Sergio. Now we want to group the very brief interventions with only a few minutes. The first one would be done by Professor James Hirschberg.